we appreciated early on that this was very, very relevant evidence. But instead, what the district attorney argued, what the police argued was that the stains recovered on the roommate's sheet had nothing to do with the rape.
At trial, the prosecution acknowledged that the stains were of a different blood type than Neil's.
There was a semen stain from a B secretor.
And Neil Miller, who was a type O secretor.
They simply said that because this stain excludes the defendant, therefore it's irrelevant.
But the prosecution presented a theory on why the semen didn't match Neil's.
They said it must have been from a consensual relationship between the roommate of the victim and a male friend.
But the Innocence Project challenges that conclusion.
No one ever interviewed the victim's roommate, much less her boyfriend.
They never went up to ask them if they were a B blood type.
No effort was made to locate that roommate. No effort was made to get a sample from her boyfriend, and that's absolutely unconscionable.
The Innocence Project now knows where Neil Miller's only shot at freedom lies.
And we wanted that bedsheet. We didn't want just the vaginal swabs.
I was calling every crime lab in Boston and every police department in Boston.
The search soon turns into a wild goose chase.
And they had to go through so many different channels. Like the police would tell them you had to go to the crime lab. The crime lab told them you had to go to the DA.
There was quite a bit of back and forth because it's a matter of navigating a particular municipality's prosecutorial system.
And it was just one big vicious circle.
Then, the Innocence Project gets some catastrophic news. The sheet has been destroyed. And the vaginal swab evidence is nowhere to be found.
If it's destroyed, then I'll never get out.
And Neil's case is almost 10 years old.
You start to worry a little bit about whether or not the evidence has been destroyed. Once the evidence is gone, there's no way to do DNA testing to prove innocence.
But the Innocence Project refuses to give up.
I got in touch with his appellate attorney, so I sort of looked at her as a resource in terms of being able to navigate the bureaucracy.
And then, an incredible stroke of luck.
All of a sudden, the evidence was able to be found.
They threw out the sheet, but fortunately, cuttings of the sheet still existed.
And the vaginal swabs turn up as well.
So I fired off a letter saying, preserve the evidence.
That was a big relief.
It's just like, okay, let's get the money so he can get tested and, get out of here.
Somehow my family got the money up.
The money wasn't an issue. Whatever we needed to do, we were going to get the money to get him out.
In 2000, the evidence from the rape case is finally sent for DNA testing. And the results reveal more than anyone expected. 10 years after being convicted for rape, Neil Miller's DNA is finally compared against the crime scene evidence.
We not only tested the rape kit, but we also demanded to test the sheet.
And then it was just a long waiting process,
So we waited and we waited.
Finally, the test results are in. The DNA from the swabs and from the sheet belong to the same individual, but not to Neil Miller.
It was one of them, oh, God, yes. What made me want to do cartwheels.
It's just like, I told you all, and it was just like, all right, now, when are you coming home?
A few weeks after the results come in, the district attorney sets a new court date for Neil.
And then we went to court in Boston for that marvelous day.
They were going to send him back to Walpole for the release papers.
And we went down to the courthouse, and they made us wait, and we prayed in the hallway.
We're now ordered that he be discharged as combatant number 035, 2, 3, and 4.
And the judge just said, no, he can go home from here.
In 2000, after a decade behind bars, Neil Miller is exonerated.
Praise be to God again. Praise be to God again. This 10-year nightmare is over.
We always knew in our hearts that he was innocent.
Luckily, the scientific evidence in this case was available to do what the law couldn't do.
And it turns up more than Neil's innocence.
After Neil was exonerated, we had a very clear profile of who the perpetrator was.
It was a bee secretor that left semen at the crime scene.
The Innocence Project encourages the DA to enter the profile into their DNA databank of convicted offenders.
And a few months later, they were notified that they'd gotten the hit.
His name? Lawrence Taylor. He has a 37-year record of criminal convictions and is currently incarcerated.
Serving time for a burglary. And he was about to finish his sentence.
And the DNA databank reveals something else. Something that could have prevented Neil from going to trial in the first place.
They found that this gentleman, Lawrence Taylor's DNA, was consistent with the semen evidence left in 3 different rapes. One of the rapes occurred just a few weeks before the rape for which Neil Miller was wrongly convicted, and the 3rd rape occurred just a few weeks after.
And each has a modus operandi that very clearly resembles the other.
We have a single individual who's using a sharpened screwdriver in at least 2 of the 3 cases in a very similar area of town.
The average viewer of television could connect the dots between those 3 cases. Why didn't they?
But in fact, someone did. The Innocence Project learns that months before Neil's trial, the lab technician who analyzed the evidence from all 3 rapes concluded that the attacks were likely committed by a serial rapist.
She shared that information, but the detective, her superiors in the crime lab, failed to pass on that information to the district attorney.
If the police had really confronted the evidence, evaluated it in a fair way, Neil never would have been charged.
Now the state has DNA evidence linking Lawrence Taylor to the rapes.
Every day in jail, I thought about this guy, and they finally got him.
But there's a problem.
The district attorney's office was unable to get the cooperation of any of the 3 victims,
Including the victim in Neil's case.
She doesn't want to go through the whole process again.
In the fall of 2003, Lawrence Taylor finishes serving his sentence. And without the cooperation of the rape victims, the DA is powerless to detain him.
They said our hands are tied, and he was released.
And that really is a public safety issue.
Especially for the residents of Boston's Back Bay area. A few months after Taylor goes free, he is arrested for 2 other break-ins in the same neighborhood where the rapes took place more than a decade earlier.
In so many of our exoneration cases, we find the real perpetrator is a serial offender.
Still out there committing more crimes.
The DA wants to charge Taylor, but the 3 victims won't testify, and the 15-year statute of limitations is just weeks away from expiring. The Innocence Project asks Miller to appeal to the victim from his case.
I was asked to write her a letter, asking her to please let the court know that she picked the wrong person.
But her response isn't what he'd hoped for.
I am writing you today to express my deepest regret that you were a second victim. I do not see how my reliving very painful memories can help you now.
She don't want that pain again. I agreed with her at that time.
But faced with the prospect of Taylor going unpunished, the victim has a change of heart.
Not more than 3 or 4 days before the 15-year statute of limitation expired, did the district attorney's office finally get the victims to come in, present the case to a grand jury, and get that indictment.
Lawrence Taylor ultimately pleads guilty to 3 rapes, including the attack which cost Neil Miller 10 years of his life.
lo and behold, there he was. And I looked at his picture and I'm like, this dude looks absolutely nothing like me.
He actually feels sorry for the guy. He's like, oh, we should pray for him.
Let him do some time. Let him see what Neil endured.
I'm like, forget him. He should be praying for you.
As the Innocence Project notes, Neil Miller's case is one of a startling number of wrongful convictions in Massachusetts.
Most of these cases were cases of mistaken identification.
In response, the DA launches major reforms of the city's eyewitness policies.
Rather than show a victim of a crime, a spread, we show victims, individuals' photos in a sequential fashion, so that they can't just compare one to another. Scientists tell us that in the spread method, a victim will select the person that most resembles the person who attacked them. In the sequential photo array, they're more likely to rely on recognition.
Had they been used in the Neil Miller case, Neil Miller would have never been charged.
Neil Miller is now 39 years old. He's trying to adjust to life on the outside.
You never truly escape that wrongful incarceration.
I always wanted to go back there, but just so I can look through the fence and look to see if I recognize my face peering out of the Walpole wall and just reach in and grab that part of me, that they stole.
We used to think that if we could get somebody out, we could free them from that hell of being wrongly convicted in prison, and everybody would have smiles forevermore.
But 10 years of incarceration of something you didn't do will beat you up mentally and physically.
Still, Neil is trying to reclaim his life.
He took a car ride from here to Ohio, and he called and he's just like, oh my goodness, I seen this and that, and I'm just like, there's a whole world out there.
There's just so much green out there. So much fresh air.
I hope he finds peace.
A shiver runs through me as the flashes come to light of my departure from the darker me.
I hope he continues to write, because he's good. He's quite good.
But the triumph of newness and my old self-esteem is a feeling of glorious worth, and with it, I will forge ahead.